That baby changed everything the moment she walked through those doors. No one in the courtroom knew it yet, but the quiet woman standing at the entrance was about to shatter every assumption they had made. Emily Carter adjusted the soft blanket wrapped around the newborn in her arms and took a slow breath. The room felt colder than usual. Rows of polished wooden benches were filled with attorneys, assistants, and curious observers waiting to witness the final chapter of a high-profile divorce. At the center of it all sat Jonathan Reed, a billionaire businessman whose name appeared in magazines, financial news, and charity galas across the country. He looked completely relaxed. Beside him sat Sophia Bennett, elegant and confident, wearing the kind of smile that suggested she already believed she had won. The moment Jonathan spotted Emily, he leaned back in his chair. His eyes dropped to the baby, then returned to her face. A faint smirk appeared. Sophia followed his gaze. "Well, that's unexpected," she whispered with a short laugh. Several heads turned. Quiet murmurs spread through the room like a passing breeze. Emily heard every word. She ignored all of it. Her focus never left the empty seat waiting for her near the front. Each step echoed across the floor. The newborn slept peacefully, unaware of the tension hanging in the air. Emily reached her chair and sat down without looking at Jonathan. That simple act unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Months ago, she would have looked nervous. She would have searched his face for answers. Today was different. There was no fear, no desperation, no attempt to change his mind. Only calm. Jonathan folded his arms. Something about her silence felt wrong. "Ready to get this over with?" he asked across the room. Emily slowly lifted her eyes. "More than you know." The answer was soft, yet it landed with surprising weight. Sophia exchanged a glance with Jonathan. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her expression. The judge entered moments later. Everyone rose. Papers shuffled. Chairs moved. Formalities began. Yet attention kept drifting back to Emily and the child in her arms. Why bring a newborn to a divorce hearing? The question seemed to hover over every seat in the room. Jonathan tried to dismiss it. He reminded himself that the settlement was nearly complete. The lawyers had reviewed everything. The outcome was supposed to be predictable. Still, a strange feeling settled in his chest. Across from him, Emily gently rocked the baby while listening to the proceedings. She looked composed, almost as if she had been waiting for this day for a very long time. Then her attorney reached into a leather briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. The movement was small, barely noticeable, yet Emily's eyes followed it instantly. Jonathan noticed that. His confidence wavered. What was inside that envelope? Why did Emily suddenly seem so certain? As the judge prepared to begin the hearing, the room grew silent once again. Nobody realized they were seconds away from hearing a truth that would change everything they thought they knew about Emily Carter, the newborn child, and the marriage Jonathan Reed believed he had already left behind. 3 years earlier, Emily Carter would have laughed if someone had told her that her marriage would end in a courtroom filled with strangers. Back then, she still believed that love could survive long work hours, missed anniversaries, and the constant pressure that came with Jonathan Reed's growing empire. Their home overlooked the Chicago skyline from nearly 40 floors above the city. At night, the lights stretched for miles beyond the windows. Emily often stood there waiting for Jonathan to come home. Sometimes he arrived before midnight. Sometimes he did not arrive until sunrise. In the beginning, he always apologized. He would bring coffee, flowers, or breakfast from her favorite bakery. He would promise that things would slow down soon. Emily wanted to believe him. For a while, she did. Success came quickly. Jonathan's company expanded into new markets. Interviews, conferences, and business trips filled his schedule. Reporters praised his ambition. Investors admired his confidence. The world saw a rising billionaire. Emily saw a husband who seemed to be drifting farther away each month. Small changes appeared first. Conversations became shorter. Dinner plans were canceled more often. His phone rarely left his hand. When she asked if everything was all right, he always gave the same answer. Just business. Emily accepted that explanation longer than she should have. Then Sophia Bennett entered the picture. Officially, she was a public relations consultant hired to help manage the company's image. Jonathan mentioned her casually during dinner one evening. Nothing about the conversation seemed important at the time. A few weeks later, Sophia's name surfaced again. Then again. Soon Emily noticed that every major event seemed to include her. Corporate galas, charity functions, industry conferences. Sophia was always nearby. Friends began making comments they thought were harmless. Emily remembered one woman smiling awkwardly at a fundraiser. Jonathan and Sophia make a great team. The words lingered long after the event ended. Emily tried not to overthink them. Trust mattered in a marriage. She reminded herself of that repeatedly, yet a quiet discomfort settled into her heart. One rainy evening, Jonathan arrived home nearly 2 hours later than expected. His suit jacket smelled faintly of expensive perfume. Not Emily's perfume. Something unfamiliar. She noticed it instantly. Jonathan did not. He walked into his office, closed the door, and spent the rest of the night on business calls. Emily sat alone in the kitchen listening to the storm outside. For the first time, doubt felt impossible to ignore. Months passed. Distance replaced intimacy. Silence replaced conversation. Jonathan seemed physically present only when necessary. Even then, his attention remained somewhere else. Emily started keeping a journal. At first, it was simply a way to organize her thoughts. Over time, it became a record of missed promises, forgotten moments, and growing loneliness. She never imagined those pages would one day matter. One afternoon, while sorting through paperwork on a shared tablet, a notification appeared on the screen. It vanished almost immediately. The message contained only a few words, yet they were enough to stop her breathing for a moment. Sophia had sent it. Emily stared at the screen long. After it disappeared, outside, traffic moved through the city as usual. Inside, something fundamental shifted. For the first time, she began wondering whether the life she believed she had was already slipping away. Emily tried to convince herself there was a reasonable explanation. One message did not prove anything. One notification was not enough to destroy years of trust. Still, the uneasy feeling refused to disappear. Over the following weeks, she paid closer attention. Not because she wanted to investigate her husband, but because she could no longer ignore the distance growing between them. Jonathan seemed increasingly distracted whenever they were together. During dinners, his phone lit up constantly. At social events, his attention drifted toward conversations that did not include her. Even his smiles felt different now, practiced rather than genuine. One Saturday morning, Emily suggested taking a short trip together. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet weekend a few hours outside the city. Jonathan barely looked up from his laptop. Maybe next month, he said. It was the same answer he had given 6 months earlier. Emily nodded and said nothing more. Later that afternoon, she scrolled through social media while sitting near the living room window. A photo from a corporate event appeared on her screen. Jonathan stood at the center of a group of executives. Sophia stood beside him. What caught Emily's attention was not the picture itself. It was the way they looked at each other. Comfortable, familiar, connected. The image lingered in her mind long after she closed the application. As autumn arrived, the tension inside their home became impossible to ignore. Entire days passed without meaningful conversation. Jonathan often left before sunrise. Sometimes he returned after midnight. Emily continued writing in her journal. Each entry became more honest than the last. She recorded dates, canceled plans, unexplained absences, and promises that quietly disappeared. The journal was no longer helping her understand Jonathan. It was helping her understand herself. One evening, while attending a charity gala, Emily noticed something that changed everything. The ballroom sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of guests filled the space. Music floated through the air. Jonathan had spent most of the evening speaking with investors. Emily stood near a table greeting guests when she saw him across the room. Sophia approached him carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. They shared a brief conversation. Then they laughed. It seemed harmless at first, yet neither of them realized Emily was watching. The expression on Jonathan's face was one she had not seen in years. He looked relaxed, present, happy. The same man who barely spoke at home suddenly appeared fully engaged. A painful realization settled over her. It was not that Jonathan no longer had warmth to give. He was simply giving it somewhere else. The drive home was silent. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the car. Jonathan reviewed emails on his phone. Emily stared at the passing city lights. Neither spoke. When they reached the apartment, Jonathan disappeared into his office as usual. Emily remained in the dark living room. For nearly an hour, she sat alone listening to the distant hum of traffic below. Then she made a decision. She would stop chasing explanations. She would stop asking questions that never received honest answers. If there was a truth hidden beneath the surface of her marriage, she would find it. What Emily did not know was that within a few weeks, a discovery would force her to leave everything behind, disappearing so completely that even Jonathan would have no idea where she had gone. The discovery arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. There was nothing dramatic about the day itself. The sky over Chicago was gray. Traffic moved slowly below the apartment. Jonathan had already left for a meeting before sunrise. Emily sat alone at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago. She was reviewing household documents when an email notification appeared on a shared account they rarely used. Normally, she would have ignored it. Something about the sender caught her attention. It was connected to a private property several states away. Emily frowned. She had never heard Jonathan mention owning real estate outside their investment portfolio. Curious, she opened the document. At first, the information seemed harmless. Then she noticed a second name attached to the records. Sophia Bennett. Emily read the page again. Then a third time. Her heartbeat quickened. The property was not a business asset. It was listed as a private residence. Utility records, maintenance invoices, and recurring expenses stretched back more than a year. The pattern was impossible to dismiss. This was not a temporary arrangement. Someone had been building a life there. Emily closed her eyes. For several long seconds, she simply sat in silence. The room suddenly felt smaller. The answers she had been searching for were beginning to emerge, yet they brought no relief. Only clarity. Later that week, she met with a financial advisor she trusted. She did not mention her suspicions directly. Instead, she asked questions about asset disclosures, ownership structures, and legal obligations within a marriage. The advisor's answers confirmed what she already feared. Significant information had never been shared with her. Driving home afterward, Emily felt strangely calm. The uncertainty that had haunted her for months was fading. Facts were replacing doubt. Once that process began, she could not stop. Quietly, carefully, she gathered information. Documents, records, dates, financial statements. She never touched Jonathan's private accounts. She did not need to. The evidence available through legitimate channels was enough. Every new discovery pointed in the same direction. Meanwhile, Jonathan seemed completely unaware of the shift taking place. He continued moving through life as if nothing had changed. Business trips became more frequent. Excuses became easier. Sometimes he stayed away for days at a time. Whenever Emily asked simple questions, his answers grew shorter. Eventually, she stopped asking altogether. That change caught his attention. One evening, he glanced up from his phone. "You have been quiet lately." Emily looked at him across the dining table. "Have I?" Jonathan nodded. "Everything okay?" The question almost made her laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it arrived months too late. "Everything is becoming clear," she said softly. Jonathan barely reacted. He assumed she was talking about something else. Within a few weeks, Emily made another discovery. This one had nothing to do with finances. It came during a routine medical appointment. The news changed her future in an instant. She sat in stunned silence as the doctor smiled warmly across the desk. Outside the office window, the city continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet Emily knew her life had just entered a completely different chapter. For the first time in months, tears filled her eyes. Not from sadness, not from fear, from the overwhelming realization that she was no longer making decisions only for herself. The doctor's words echoed in Emily's mind long after the appointment ended. She walked through downtown Chicago in a daze, surrounded by thousands of people who had no idea her entire world had shifted in a single afternoon. She was going to be a mother. The realization felt overwhelming, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. For several days, she kept the news to herself. Not because she wanted to hide it forever, but because she needed time to process what it meant. Every future decision suddenly carried greater weight. Every choice affected more than just her own life. Back at the apartment, Jonathan remained absorbed in his expanding business empire. Meetings filled his calendar. Phone calls consumed his evenings. Some nights, he barely noticed whether Emily was in the room. Watching him now, she felt a growing sadness. This should have been the kind of news that brought two people together. Instead, she found herself wondering whether the man she married would even understand its significance anymore. A week later, Emily decided to tell him. She planned a quiet dinner at home. Nothing elaborate. Just an evening without distractions. For once, Jonathan arrived on time. He seemed tired but unusually relaxed. As they sat across from each other, Emily felt her heart racing. She had imagined this moment countless times. In every version, there had been excitement, joy, celebration. Reality unfolded differently. Before she could speak, Jonathan's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. His expression changed instantly. Not alarm, not concern, anticipation. He stood from the table. "I need to take this," he said. Emily watched him disappear into another room. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The food grew cold. Eventually Jonathan returned, collected his jacket, and offered a quick apology about an urgent business matter. Within seconds, he was gone again. Emily remained alone at the table. The words she had planned to say never left her lips. That night she sat beside the window overlooking the city. Below, streams of headlights moved through the darkness. Above, clouds covered the stars. She rested a hand against her stomach and made a quiet promise. No matter what happened next, she would protect the future now growing inside her. The following month brought more answers than she expected. Documents continued revealing hidden financial arrangements. Travel records exposed repeated visits to the private residence connected to Sophia. Then came something even harder to ignore. A photograph appeared in an online business publication. Jonathan and Sophia stood together outside an event in another state. The article described them as an influential partnership. Emily stared at the image for a long time. Strangely, she felt no anger, only certainty. The marriage she had spent years trying to save already existed only on paper. 2 days later, she packed a single suitcase. She left behind the luxury apartment, the skyline views, and the life everyone assumed she wanted. Before walking out, she placed a brief note on the kitchen counter. It contained only one sentence. "I need time away to think about the future." Then she stepped into the elevator and disappeared from Jonathan Reed's world completely, unaware that months later her unexpected return would leave an entire courtroom speechless. Jonathan did not realize Emily was truly gone until nearly a week had passed. At first, he assumed she needed space. Their conversations had become so infrequent that her absence felt like an extension of the distance already separating them. He sent a brief text message. No response came. 2 days later, he called. The call went to voicemail. By the end of the second week, irritation replaced concern. Jonathan convinced himself that Emily would eventually return once her emotions settled. He buried himself deeper in work, attending meetings across the country while investors praised another record-breaking quarter. Outwardly, everything appeared successful. Privately, small cracks were beginning to form. Emily, meanwhile, had rented a modest apartment in a quiet town nearly 600 miles away. The pace of life there felt completely different from Chicago. No luxury towers, no red carpet events, no constant headlines about corporate deals. For the first time in years, she could hear herself think. Each morning she walked through a nearby park, breathing crisp air while planning for the future. Her doctor appointments became her priority. She focused on building stability instead of chasing answers. The peace she found surprised her. Months passed. Her pregnancy progressed smoothly. Friends from her previous life occasionally reached out, but Emily shared very little. She had learned that not everyone needed access to her story. Some chapters were meant to remain private until the right moment. Back in Chicago, Jonathan's life grew increasingly intertwined with Sophia's. Public appearances became more frequent. Industry blogs speculated about their relationship. Neither of them openly addressed the rumors. Jonathan simply ignored them. He told himself that his marriage had already been falling apart long before Emily left. It was an explanation that sounded reasonable whenever he repeated it. Yet something continued bothering him. Emily had disappeared without demanding money, attention, or revenge. She had not contacted reporters. She had not created public drama. She had simply vanished. The silence unsettled him more than anger ever could. One evening, nearly 7 months after Emily's departure, Jonathan returned to his penthouse after a corporate gala. The city lights stretched beyond the windows exactly as they always had. Everything looked the same. Nothing felt the same. As he walked through the apartment, he noticed a journal sitting on a bookshelf. Somehow it had escaped his attention all those months. Curious, he opened it. The pages contained entries spanning years. Missed dinners, forgotten promises, lonely holidays, moments he barely remembered. With each page, Jonathan felt a growing sense of discomfort. This was not the story he had told himself. It was not the version he shared with colleagues or friends. For the first time, he saw the gradual damage from Emily's perspective. He closed the journal and stared into the darkness outside. Questions he had avoided for months suddenly demanded answers. Where was Emily now? Why had she left without a fight? Most importantly, what had she been carrying with her when she walked away from the life they once built together? Unknown to Jonathan, the answer was only weeks away from changing the course of the divorce hearing he believed would be nothing more than a routine legal formality. The courtroom remained silent as Emily's attorney finally opened the sealed envelope. Even the soft rustle of paper seemed unusually loud. Jonathan straightened in his chair. Across from him, Emily gently adjusted the blanket around the sleeping infant. Her calmness no longer looked mysterious. It looked deliberate. The judge reviewed the first set of documents while attorneys on both sides waited. Jonathan expected financial records, asset disclosures, standard legal arguments. Instead, the discussion moved in an entirely different direction. Emily's attorney began presenting a timeline. Dates appeared. Travel records followed. Financial documents connected to the private residence surfaced next. Jonathan's expression tightened. Sophia shifted uncomfortably beside him. Neither of them had expected these details to become part of the hearing. The evidence itself was not dramatic. No single document changed everything. What mattered was the pattern they revealed. Month after month, decision after decision, hidden arrangements, undisclosed expenditures, separate plans quietly built while a marriage still existed on paper. The judge listened carefully. Jonathan's legal team attempted to minimize the significance. Yet every explanation seemed weaker than the last. Then Emily's attorney paused. The room grew still. He reached for another file and placed it before the judge. Jonathan felt a sudden knot form in his stomach. For the first time all morning, genuine concern appeared in his eyes. Emily watched silently. Her attorney began discussing the months immediately after her departure from Chicago. Medical records were introduced. Appointment dates, insurance documents, routine healthcare information. Sophia frowned, confused by the direction of the conversation. Jonathan appeared equally puzzled. Neither understood where this was leading. Then the attorney asked a simple question. Mr. Reed, during the period following Mrs. Reed's departure, how often did you attempt direct contact? Jonathan hesitated. The answer sounded worse when spoken aloud than it had inside his own head. A few calls. A handful of messages. Nothing consistent. Nothing sustained. The courtroom absorbed that answer quietly. Emily lowered her gaze toward the baby. Several observers exchanged glances. The attorney continued. More records appeared. More dates. More evidence of a woman navigating a life-changing journey largely on her own. Jonathan's confidence continued slipping away. Something felt terribly wrong. He just could not identify it yet. Then Emily's attorney delivered the question that changed the atmosphere completely. Mr. Reed, were you aware that your wife was expecting a child when she left? The room froze. Jonathan blinked. For several seconds he simply stared. What? The word escaped before he could stop it. Sophia turned toward him immediately. Her expression transformed from confusion to shock. Emily remained silent. The baby slept peacefully, unaware that every eye in the room had suddenly shifted toward him. Jonathan's face lost color. Memories flooded back. The interrupted dinner. The night he rushed away for a phone call. The growing silence before Emily disappeared. Pieces of a puzzle he had ignored for months suddenly began fitting together. No, he finally answered, his voice barely above a whisper. I did not know. The admission hung in the air. Across the courtroom, Emily slowly lifted her eyes. For the first time that day, Jonathan truly looked at the child resting in her arms. A terrifying possibility entered his mind, one that he was not yet prepared to face. The silence that followed felt endless. Jonathan stared at the infant as though seeing him for the first time. Every assumption he had carried into the courtroom was beginning to collapse. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering something urgently, but Jonathan barely heard a word. His attention remained fixed on Emily and the child in her arms. Across the room, Sophia looked equally stunned. The confidence she had displayed earlier had vanished completely. Emily's attorney allowed the moment to settle before presenting the final group of documents. Birth records, medical timelines, Official paperwork establishing dates that aligned perfectly with Emily's departure. The facts spoke for themselves. No dramatic speech was necessary. No emotional argument was required. Reality had already entered the room. Jonathan swallowed hard. Suddenly he understood why Emily had seemed so calm. She had not come seeking sympathy. She had not arrived hoping to win an argument. She had walked into the courtroom carrying the truth. For months, she had navigated pregnancy, medical appointments, and the challenges of becoming a new mother without him. Not because she wanted to exclude him, because he had never truly been present long enough to know what was happening. The realization struck harder than any accusation could have. Memories surfaced one after another. The unanswered opportunities. The conversations he rushed through. The evenings he prioritized work over home. Most painful of all was the memory of that dinner when Emily had clearly wanted to tell him something important. He remembered her expression now. The hesitation. The anticipation. He remembered standing up to answer a phone call instead. Jonathan lowered his head. For perhaps the first time in years, he felt genuine regret. Sophia shifted in her seat. The atmosphere surrounding her had changed as well. Throughout the hearing, she had listened to details she had never known. Hidden properties. Incomplete disclosures. Personal decisions Jonathan had never fully explained. The version of him she thought she understood suddenly seemed less certain. Less admirable. She looked away without saying a word. The judge reviewed the final documents carefully before speaking. The legal discussion that followed was straightforward. Yet emotionally, everything had already been decided. Jonathan's public image as the composed billionaire remained intact on the surface, but inside he felt something far more important slipping away. Not money, not status, opportunity, time, moments that could never be recovered. He slowly looked toward Emily. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked quietly. The question sounded fragile, almost desperate. Emily met his gaze. There was sadness in her eyes, but no anger. "I tried," she answered. Only 2 words. Nothing more was needed. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. The truth of that answer settled over him like a weight. Across the courtroom, even casual observers could sense the shift. This was no longer a dispute about assets or paperwork. It was the story of choices, priorities, and consequences. The judge eventually announced a short recess. As people began standing, Jonathan remained seated. Emily gently rocked the baby, who had just started to stir awake. For the first time, Jonathan saw not a legal proceeding, but a family he had nearly lost before he even understood it existed. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had completely changed. Earlier that morning, Jonathan Reed had arrived believing he was closing a chapter. Now he sat in silence, realizing he had barely understood the story at all. The remaining legal matters moved forward quickly. Agreements were reviewed. Final decisions were discussed. Yet everyone's attention kept drifting toward Emily and the baby resting peacefully in her arms. The child had become a living reminder of everything that had been overlooked. Throughout the proceedings, Emily remained composed. She answered questions clearly. She never raised her voice. She never tried to embarrass Jonathan. That quiet dignity affected the room more than anger ever could. The judge eventually finalized the divorce. With a few simple words, the marriage officially came to an end. Emily listened without visible emotion. She had already accepted that reality long ago. For her, the hardest chapter had not ended in court. It had ended the day she chose to walk away and build a future on her own terms. As attorneys began gathering documents, Jonathan stood slowly from his chair. For a moment, it seemed as though he wanted to say something but could not find the words. Then he finally crossed the room. Sophia remained behind. She watched silently, her expression distant. Whatever confidence had once existed between her and Jonathan appeared gone. Some truths changed relationships forever. Jonathan stopped a few feet from Emily. The baby had just opened his eyes, staring curiously at the unfamiliar surroundings. Jonathan looked at him for several seconds. There was wonder in his expression. Regret too. "He is beautiful," he said quietly. Emily glanced down at her son before looking back at Jonathan. "He is." A long silence followed. The noise of the courtroom seemed to fade into the background. Jonathan took a slow breath. "I cannot change what happened." His voice was unsteady. "But I wish I had known." Emily studied him carefully. For the first time in years, she believed he was being completely honest. "Knowing would not have mattered if you were never truly present," she replied gently. The words were not cruel. They were simply true. Jonathan lowered his gaze. He understood that now. Success had given him many things. Wealth, recognition, influence. Yet somewhere along the way, he had mistaken achievement for attention. He had assumed there would always be time later for the people who mattered most. Standing there, he finally understood how costly that assumption had been. Emily adjusted the blanket around her son and headed toward the courtroom doors. Sunlight streamed through the windows beyond the hallway. A new life waited outside. Not a perfect one, not an easy one, but a hopeful one. Just before she left, Jonathan spoke once more. "I hope he knows I cared." Emily paused. Then she offered the smallest smile of the entire day. "That depends on what you do next." With that, she walked away. Jonathan remained where he stood, watching until she disappeared from sight. For the first time in many years, there were no meetings to attend, no investors to impress, no headlines to chase. Only a lesson he would carry forever. Some opportunities arrive quietly. Some leave quietly too. The difference between regret and gratitude is often noticing them before they are gone.